Welcome back. Today we're going to continue with phonology, and in particular, we're going to look at some of the common kinds of phonological rules that you see over and over again across different languages. So just to remind us some of the core concepts in phonology, the phoneme is a single underlying sound which can be expressed as multiple phonetic variants in speech, which are called allophones. Phonemes represent sounds that are distinct for the purpose of distinguishing words, in other words, contrastive sounds. Speakers of a language might perceive allophones of the same phoneme as the same sound, even if they are phonetically distinct from one context to another. If two sounds are contrastive, then they must come from different phonemes. Those two sounds must be two realizations of two different phonemes. If there's a minimal pair for two sounds, then they're contrastive, and therefore they represent two different phonemes. For example, we've looked quite a bit at this example in English. In English, we have phonemes and allophones. For example, we have a phoneme P, which is expressed as the sound aspirated P, as in pat, in certain contexts, and in other contexts, that phoneme is expressed as the sound unaspirated P, as in spat. And we also have, say, the phoneme B, which is a distinct phoneme from P, which means that if you interchange B and P, you get different words. The phoneme B is usually expressed simply as the sound B, the voiced bilabial stop. We've talked about phonological rules. A phonological rule describes how the underlying phonemes translate into the actual phones that you get. For example, this is a set of phonological rules which describes the distribution of the allophones nasal a and oral a in English. So we have that the phoneme a is expressed as the sound nasalized a when it appears before nasal consonants. And the phoneme a is expressed as the sound a elsewhere. The general format for a rule is phoneme is expressed as phone when it appears in a conditioning environment. And that conditioning environment is best described in terms of natural classes. That's a set of sounds that share some feature. For example, a natural class might be something like a vowel. So you might say a conditioning context is just that you get some particular sound after a vowel, or after a nasal consonant, or after a voiced stop. Those are natural classes as they appear in conditioning contexts for phonological rules. So we're going to talk today about the kinds of phonological rules. If you've started doing your phonology problems, or if you've just paid attention to the examples I've been using, you'll have noticed that we see the same kinds of rules showing up over and over again across the different examples we're looking at. So we see the same kinds of rules over and over again, and today we're going to classify those kinds of rules. We're going to name the common kinds of rules, and this is going to help you do phonological analysis because you'll start noticing that the same kinds of patterns show up over and over again. I'm going to describe 6 common kinds of phonological rules. They are assimilation, insertion, deletion, strengthening, weakening, and metathesis. So let's take a look. We'll start with assimilation. You've already seen many examples of assimilation, although maybe you didn't know it was called that yet. So assimilation is when a phonological rule changes a sound to make it more similar to a neighboring sound. You should think of if you've seen any examples of this so far. So the number one example you've already seen is nasal assimilation. We saw this in English vowels. We had this pair of phonological rules describing the distribution of the allophones of the phoneme a in English. So basically, we have that the phoneme a is expressed as the sound nasalized a when it appears before nasal consonants. Essentially, the nasality of that following consonant sort of bleeds into that vowel that comes before the consonant, right? So the vowel assimilates to the following consonant. The vowel picks up a nasal feature from the following consonant. Another example would be like in the word man, you have a nasalized feature on the vowel, which has sort of seeped into the vowel from the following consonant. In something like mad, you have an oral vowel. Underlyingly, phonemically, it's the same vowel. It's always an a. The difference between nasal and unnasalized a in English is not contrastive. So underlyingly, we have the same phonemes, but these are expressed as different sounds. The vowel is becoming more similar to the following consonant in that the vowel is becoming nasalized. You can think about this as a kind of spreading. It's kind of like that nasal feature that lives in the following consonant N sort of spreads out and contaminates the vowel that comes before it. That is assimilation, extremely common kind of rule. Many, many phonological rules you're going to encounter have the flavor of assimilation, sounds that are next to each other becoming more similar to each other. Another example that you can see in English involves a phonetic distinction that we haven't quite talked about yet. So this is going to be another example where you're going to say some English words slowly, think about how you're pronouncing them, and you'll realize maybe you're not pronouncing them the way you thought you were. So here are some examples. So let's think about the word plays. I'd like you to say plays very slowly, and think about the L sound in plays. And in particular, is that L voiced? So remember to check for voicing. We feel on our voice boxes to feel, is the voice box vibrating while you are articulating the sound? So in plays, I'm interested in the L. Say it slowly. Plays, plays. You'll notice that the L in plays is actually unvoiced. Plays. If you write down a narrow phonetic transcription of what you're actually saying when you say plays, then the L is unvoiced. Now we indicate that using the circle that we draw under the L there, which indicates that the L is phonetically unvoiced there in a word like plays. You have the same effect in a word like clue. If you say clue, you'll notice the L is not really voiced when you say it. Same in a word like sly, sly, sly. The L is unvoiced, but not in a word like glaze. When you say glaze, the voicing persists throughout the L, so that is a voiced L. Now, what is the phonological rule that determines whether you're going to get a voiced or an unvoiced L in English? We know that the underlying phoneme is the same because voiced and unvoiced L don't form any contrastive pairs, no minimal pairs in English. This is the phonological rule. The phoneme L is expressed as the sound unvoiced L after a voiceless obstruent. So that, remember, includes fricatives, affricates, and stops, which are all unvoiced. So that includes the P, the K, and the S in plays, clue, and sly. And the phoneme L is expressed as the sound voiced L elsewhere. So this is voicing assimilation. Basically, the unvoiced P, K, or S, the unvoiced feature of that sound spreads into the following sound, and the L, as a result, is unvoiced. So when you say play, clue, sly, there's a voicing assimilation where the L becomes unvoiced so that it's more similar to the unvoiced consonant that comes before it. Voicing assimilation is very, very common across languages. Sounds can either become unvoiced or voiced in order to match the sounds that they're next to. Another very common kind of assimilation, this is a special kind of assimilation which is so common it gets its own name, is what's called palletization. Palletization is exemplified by this example in English. When you say did you, like did you eat, often in faster speech this comes out as did you eat. So what's happening here is that the phoneme d, when it's next to the phoneme y, the voiced palatal glide, when the d is next to the y, then the d acquires some of the palatal nature from the y, and it becomes j. So did you becomes did you. That's palletization. Palletization is a rule that makes a consonant post-alveolar or palatal when it appears before a palatal consonant or a front vowel. So it's kind of like the d in did you is getting pulled a bit back in the mouth, so it's more like a palatal consonant. It goes to the post-alveolar place of articulation and you get did you. So common kinds of palletization rules look like this. You have stuff like a t becoming a ch when it appears before the sound e or the sound y. K becomes ch before e or y. D and g both become j when they appear before e or y. This is something that happened historically in the English language, which is why we have words like general, which are spelled with a g because they were originally pronounced with a g, but the sound is now j. That's a palletization rule. And s becomes j when it appears before e or y. Z becoming j when it appears before e or y. Palletization, very, very common kind of assimilation rule. The last kind of assimilation I'm going to talk about is place assimilation. This is also exemplified in English. So let's take a look at some words and let's think about how they are pronounced, how they are actually pronounced. We have the word unstable, the word unbelievable, and the word unclear. So let's say them slowly. We have unstable, unstable, and let's pay attention to the N, the nasal consonant that's in there. Unstable. When you say unstable, that is an alveolar nasal with the tip of your tongue against the alveolar ridge. Now when you say unbelievable, unbelievable, what is actually going on with that nasal? In many cases, especially in faster speech, it actually becomes an M. It becomes a bilabial nasal, and what you say is actually unbelievable. Not unbelievable, but in fast speech, you're often going to say unbelievable with an M. Similarly, in unclear, are you really going to say unclear with the alveolar nasal? Often you're going to say unclear with the velar nasal ing, unclear. So this prefix un is the same prefix across these different instances. This is actually bringing us into the morphology section of the class a little bit, but I think you can take it. So un is the prefix here. It's always the same prefix un, which ends with the phoneme of the alveolar nasal n. But that n then undergoes place assimilation. So its place of articulation changes to match the place of articulation of the following consonant. So underlyingly unbelievable, the n assimilates to the b and you get unbelievable. Before an alveolar consonant, it becomes alveolar n. Before a bilabial consonant, it becomes bilabial m. Before a velar consonant, it becomes a velar eng. So this would be the phonemic analysis for these forms in English. This creates an interesting scenario where when you see the sound M, you don't actually know if that is realizing the phoneme M or realizing the phoneme N. Because of this phonological rule here, the phoneme N might actually be realized as the sound M. Very interesting. This is what's called neutralization. Neutralization refers to a scenario where a phonological rule creates a context where you can't tell what phoneme a particular sound actually is realizing. So two different phonemes get mapped onto one phone. In this case, and sometimes an M is underlyingly the phoneme M, but sometimes an M is actually underlyingly the phoneme N, which has just undergone place assimilation. So that concludes assimilation. I talked through 4 common kinds of assimilation, things like nasalization, nasal assimilation, voicing assimilation, palletization, and place assimilation. Now we're going to move on to the next common kind of phonological rule, which is insertion. Insertion is a phonological rule that introduces a segment. It introduces a sound that was not present in the underlying form. This is also called epenthesis. The technical term for this phonological process is epenthesis, or insertion. So, as an example, in English we have something called voiceless stop insertion. Here's what that looks like. A word like strength, which underlyingly has the phonemes s, t, e, eng, and then th, comes out phonetically often as strength. So a k sound ends up in this word inserted between the eng and the th. Another example would be hamster. Underlyingly, we have h, m, st, but then phonetically, especially in faster speech, we're going to get hamster with a p being inserted between the m and the s. So the rule here is that after a nasal consonant and before an obstruent, you insert a voiced stop with the same place of articulation as the nasal consonant. This is a rule that exists in English, and it gives you things like strength and hamster. Here's how you would write that rule. Now, the phonological rules we've been writing so far all look like some phoneme is realized as some sound. What's going on here is we're saying that the empty phoneme, the lack of a phoneme, indicated with this empty set symbol here. So basically this says the phoneme nothing is realized as the sound P when it appears between M and S. So in order to write an insertion rule, what you write is the empty set is expressed as the sound, whatever, in the context, whatever. For the strength example, we would have to have a rule that looks like this. The empty phoneme is expressed as the sound k when it appears between eng and s in strength. That's insertion. The next thing we're going to look at is deletion. And as you might imagine, deletion is the mirror image of insertion. So deletion is a phonological rule that removes a segment that was present in the underlying form. An example, very prominent example, is what's called H deletion in English. So in a sentence like, he handed her his hat, often in fast speech, what you say is, he handed her his hat. Notice that when I say, he handed her his hat, I've dropped two of the H sounds, which would have been there if I was speaking more slowly and carefully. So underlyingly, the phonemes are, he handed her his hat, but the sound that you actually produce is, he handed her his hat, dropping some of the H's. That's a deletion rule. The rule is that an initial H in a word is deleted when it appears before an unstressed vowel. In order to write that as a phonological rule, we again use this empty set thing. We say the phoneme H is expressed as nothing when it appears before an unstressed vowel. This rule shows free variation, right? So I've said that in slow, careful speech, you might preserve these H's, but in faster speech, you might drop the H's. So whether you keep or drop the H is not determined by a phonological rule. It's kind of random. You can do one or the other. That's free variation. The next kind of rule is strengthening. Strengthening is any kind of phonological rule that has the function of making a sound more phonetically distinct. It's also called fortition. That's the more technical term for this. An example of this is the aspiration rule that we've been paying so close attention to in English. So in English, we have this rule that says the phoneme T is expressed as the sound aspirated T when it appears before a stressed vowel except after fricatives. Aspiration has the effect of making an unvoiced consonant louder, longer, and more acoustically distinct from a voiced consonant. So it's an example of strengthening. It also makes the sound a bit harder to produce. It takes a little bit more effort to produce an aspirated sound like ta as opposed to an unaspirated sound like da. It takes a bit more breath. It takes a bit more energy. And the payoff for investing that extra effort in pronouncing this sound is that it's more acoustically distinct from other sounds. Now, weakening is, as you might imagine, the mirror image of strengthening. Weakening is any phonological rule that makes a sound less phonetically distinct, and the more technical term for this is lenition. So an example of this is what's called flapping in English, something which we have alluded to. English has a phonological rule, American English at least, has a phonological rule, which says that the phoneme T is expressed as the sound, the voiced alveolar flap, r, when it appears between a stressed vowel and an unstressed vowel. This flap, the r, in a word like bottle or water, it's quieter and shorter than an actual phonetic T. So this is an example of weakening. This is a case where the weaker sound is less phonetically distinct, but it's easier to say. It takes less effort, it takes less energy to make the sound r, as opposed to the sound t. So in this case, you're making the opposite trade-off that you were making in strengthening. Here, you are doing the easier thing. You could even say you're being a little lazy here. And as a result, you don't have to expend as much effort when you're speaking. The cost is that you have a sound which is not as phonetically distinct as a full t. Now remember, English also has a strengthening rule which applies to the phoneme T in other contexts. So in certain contexts you strengthen the T, in other contexts you weaken the T. The aspiration is strengthening and the flapping is an instance of weakening. This weakening process can also cause neutralization. Remember, neutralization means you create a scenario where you can't tell what the underlying phoneme is from the sounds. So let's take a look at these words. We have the word ride, the word rider, we have the word mad, we have the word matter in English, and I've given you the phonetic transcriptions for these. We have ride, then we have rider with a flap. We have mad, and then we have matter with a flap. We also have a flapping rule which applies to D in addition to T in English. And that means that when you have underlyingly a sequence of phonemes that looks like I, d, in rider, then the d is going to be expressed as the alveolar flap, and so the phonetic form is rider. Now, this creates neutralization because both the underlying D and the underlying T, these phonemes, can be realized as the sound, the voiced alveolar flap, r. This means that you can actually have situations where you have two distinct words which sound the same. So the word right has a T, has the phoneme T, and the word writer correspondingly has the phoneme T, since it's a form of the word right. But then that phoneme T is expressed phonetically as the sound r with the flap, writer, and it sounds exactly the same as writer. So writer, like writing with a pen, sounds the same as rider, like riding a horse. Writer and writer. This is an example of neutralization. Although the underlying phonemes are different, these are distinct words, still the phonetic sound that you get for these two words is the same because of the weakening process that happened here, because of the phonological rule. Another example of weakening is vowel reduction. This is something which applies a lot in English. So if you take a word like photograph, underlyingly in terms of the phonemes, that's photograph, so the second vowel is an O. But then as that's pronounced, it comes out as photograph. So the T weakens into a flap, as we've seen, but also the vowel O weakens into a schwa, that sound, photograph. A vowel becomes a schwa when it is in an unstressed syllable. In general, vowel reduction means that a vowel moves towards the mid and the center of the vowel space, towards that area that is a lot easier to articulate because you don't have to move your tongue very much to say that sound. A final example of weakening is what's called final devoicing. This is something that doesn't happen in English, but it does happen very, very frequently in other languages. So I'll give you some examples from German. In German, there's this word Land, which has the phonemes l, a, n, d. It means country, as in the name of the country Deutschland, which means Germany. And phonetically, it comes out as Land with a T at the end. So underlyingly, the final phoneme in this word is a voiced D. But phonetically, the last sound in this word, as it's pronounced, is the unvoiced T. Similarly, the word Tag means day. Underlyingly, the last phoneme there is a G, which is reflected in the spelling. But in terms of phonetics, what you say is Tag with an unvoiced K at the end. Also, the word Gip, which is the verb give. If I say give me that, it would be gip. And again, the final phoneme there is a B, but the final sound is a P, the unvoiced bilabial stop. You see this also in Russian. Famous name of this politician, Gorbachev. The final sound is pronounced as an F, even though the underlying phoneme is a V. So we see these are cases where some phoneme at the end of a word becomes unvoiced in the sound as it's pronounced. This often applies to voiced obstruents. This is also very interestingly, people who have speech disorders, even in English, will often do this in English, even though it's not a phonological rule in English. But it is a phonological rule in other languages. And the final kind of phonological rule that I'm going to talk about is metathesis. Metathesis, pronounced metathesis, is a phonological rule that reverses the order of two sounds. So it swaps the order. So for example, in English, a word like comfortable, the phonemes are comfortable, but as it's pronounced, especially in faster speech, it comes out as comfortable. So the order of the the syllabic R there, and the consonant T is reversed in the sound as opposed to the underlying phonemes. We also will often say pretty instead of pretty. So the underlying phonemes there are P, T, and then the order of the sounds as they're pronounced is P, D, with also some flapping applying to the T. So the order of the sounds is reversed. That's metathesis. This is characteristic of fast speech in English. So this is something which is subject to free variation in English. But in other languages, there are other languages where metathesis is a phonological rule that applies even in careful speech. So it's something that applies in complementary distribution rather than free variation.